Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I was quite saddened on October 5th to learn of the death at age 56 of Steve Jobs, the founder and CEO of Apple, as well as the founder of Pixar. He was certainly a brilliant and highly creative entrepreneur who brought to the world many products that millions of consumers throughout the world enjoy. And while Apple is not my favorite company, Apple's products are not my favorite products in terms of either personal computers or MP3 players, I think that this man's presence in the world, his activities, his ideals and aspirations made the world a better place. So it is quite saddening that he has died at such a young age, and that essentially a vacuum has formed, and his creative energy, his ideas for how to make products, how to improve products, how to improve the lives of consumers, that vacuum is not going to be filled, at least not right away. Now, Steve Jobs, in my view, had his virtues and he had his failings. And with regard to his virtues, I think those are quite obvious. With regard to his failings, he has been rightly criticized for maintaining a culture of extreme secrecy and micromanagement at Apple, as well as for trying to sue his competition out of existence via the use and abuse of intellectual property laws. Whatever one might think of the validity of those laws, it seems quite unjustified what Apple has been trying to do to its competitors in the smartphone market, trying to sue the Android phone manufacturers out of existence. So definitely a mixed character, and I think also a mixed character in his philosophical views. My focus today will be on remarks from his 2005 commencement address at Stanford University. In this address, Steve Jobs presented a mixture of ideas that are highly stimulating and inspiring, but also ideas that, to someone like me, who is an advocate of individualism and technological progress and indefinite human life extension, are quite frustrating, because I think Steve Jobs made many elementary errors during the latter third of his address when he was discussing death. Steve Jobs' philosophy on death, I think, is all too typical today. It is a philosophy of accepting the inevitability of death and even finding a great deal of merit and desirability in the occurrence of death. So I will go through Jobs' remarks one at a time and identify what I consider to be the crucial flaws in what he is saying. And it's unfortunate because were it not for those remarks, his speech would be excellent and quite motivating to the next generation of entrepreneurs, including entrepreneurs who I think have an extremely high potential, not a certainty, but at the very least a high potential of solving this terrible problem of human mortality, an upper limit on the human lifespan that we unfortunately experience today. Jobs starts his discussion on death with a quotation: "If you live each day as if it were your last, someday you'll most certainly be right." And he continues by saying that during his life he asked himself every day, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I'm about to do today? And he says, whenever the answer has been no for too many days in a row, I know I need to change something. My response to this is threefold. First of all, much human accomplishment involves long-term planning, not only over the course of days, but over the course of months, years, and decades. To start a project that changes the world, as Steve Jobs certainly has done with the many technologies that he brought us, it would seem quite imprudent to adopt a short-term attitude, living each day as if it were one's last. Because if there's this terminal horizon at the end of the day, then one would be motivated to only seek a very short-term gain, whatever will pay off today, whatever will bring one immediate enjoyment today, whatever one can enjoy in the present moment, essentially, or a few minutes from now, a few hours from now, until the day ends. And this is, of course, the exact opposite of a long-term oriented attitude, where sometimes today one might accept having to endure certain suboptimalities or certain frustrations if those are instrumental in achieving a longer-term benefit, a longer-term objective. So it seems that in terms of innovation, the desirable attitude is to look far into the future, farther into the future than most people wish to look or perhaps dare to look, because the world will look very different in the future, and a lot of people are fearful of contemplating significant deviations from the status quo. To look into the future and to plan in that very uncertain future, to take steps today that might not be in themselves immediately pleasant, but will involve significant payoffs later on, that, I think, is the essence of innovation. And implicitly, Steve Jobs has been doing that. It seems that his explicit philosophy here was in conflict with the actions he took as the founder of multiple businesses, the developer of many products that took years, and the collaborative work of hundreds of people to bring to fruition. Second, if the point of his statement is to enjoy life in the present, I do not disagree. I think it's desirable to enjoy what one is doing even if it's not physically pleasant, or even if it's not gripping or exciting right in the present moment. Perhaps the recognition that what one is doing for the future is going to really create some amazing benefits can be a motivating force, can be something that emotionally and intellectually keeps one enjoying the present moment, even if one's tasks at the present moment might be tedious or repetitive or uninteresting in some way or another. I think it's still good to enjoy doing that if it has a real meaningful purpose and will pay off later on. But that does not require the threat of an impending death or an eventual death of any sort. It just requires reason. It requires understanding why you're doing what you're doing and what the benefits of that are going to be. It requires a very calm, rational, down-to-earth attitude, and one's own annihilation doesn't need to come into the picture. It's as if to enjoy the visual world, to enjoy all of the colors and textures and shapes that occur in many varieties all around us, one had to somehow conceive of the possibility or the inevitability of one's vision eventually being extinguished. It's as if you can't enjoy the visual world properly unless you thought that sometime in the undefined future someone was inevitably going to pour acid into your eyes and render you blind. I disagree with that. The threat of losing one's vision, or the inevitability of losing one's vision, has nothing to do with enjoying sight. Sight is enjoyable in and of itself, or it's enjoyable as an instrumental means to some other end. But the loss of X does not make X more valuable. And third, with regard to that point, why the defeatist attitude toward death? Why assume that everyone inevitably is going to die just because this has happened in the past? It seems to automatically discount the possibility of technological progress and the possibility of human innovation getting us to a point where we actually defeat this peril. It presupposes something that really would need to be rigorously demonstrated, and to rigorously demonstrate an impossibility is close to impossible. Not impossible in all cases, not impossible from the standpoint of using a logical argument to rule out something that's self-contradictory, but from the standpoint of demonstrating an empirical impossibility with regard to what humans will be able to accomplish in the future, that is, at the very least, extremely difficult, and Jobs has not done the work to demonstrate that impossibility. He has just assumed it. Jobs said, "Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important." And here, we really have to confront what death actually does. Death doesn't just eradicate one's embarrassments and fears and irrational trepidations. Death leaves nothing. It spares neither the important nor the unimportant. It is absolute non-existence. It's the eradication of the individual. It's nothingness. For oneself, from one's own perspective, if one dies, nothing survives. Not one's fears or failings, but also not one's accomplishments or virtues. Those die with oneself as well, along with one's memories of what one's life had been. So it seems like Jobs was being quite selective in what he emphasized in terms of death sweeping away. Yes, death does sweep away insecurities and fears, because one can't experience those either, but I would rather experience insecurities and fears than nothing at all. If that were the choice, to exist in a fearful state or to not exist as an individual at all, I would choose the most fearful existence possible. Of course, having an existence devoid of irrational fears is better than having an existence with irrational fears, but again, eradicating those irrational fears does not involve accepting one's mortality or glorifying it in some way. And it seems to me that I could turn around this question and ask, why strive for anything? Why try to accomplish anything if everything will be obliterated from one's own perspective at the very least? And asking that question does not make one a nihilist, because I think a coherent answer, a life-affirming answer, is possible. The answer is, it's the struggle against death, not the acceptance of death, that can confer genuine hope and motivation. The fact is, we are alive right now, and we should strive to do everything possible to prolong that, to enhance that, to increase both the duration and the quality of our lives. And this is what enables our activities to be meaningful. This is what justifies our striving and accomplishment and attempts at self-improvement. Not thinking, oh, I'll be wiped out someday, so I'd better make the most of my time right now, but rather, I have this existence, I want to preserve it, I want to hold on to it as long as possible, and I want to make it as enjoyable as possible, and whether or not I will die eventually, neither of those is guaranteed, but I am going to fight for my life. I am going to fight for my life no matter what the circumstances are, no matter where I start out, and no matter what my condition eventually becomes. That's what is truly motivating. That is what really justifies human striving. Jobs continues by saying, "Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose." And I respond, well, clearly, no, you have your life to lose. And that's the most significant loss. What happened to Steve Jobs was the most significant loss for him. There could not have been a greater loss. And, of course, it was also a loss for the rest of us, because a great innovator has perished. But it isn't nothing. Indeed, there are many decisions that an individual could make in the course of life that significantly increase the probability of loss of life, even if that's not what one is after when one is making those decisions. But clearly, if everything else depends on one's being alive, then those decisions that increase the probability of the loss of life are those that should be avoided the most. And it's true that many people are held back from accomplishing what they want, and indeed what would be best for them, due to irrational fears. I think Jobs takes entirely the wrong approach in emphasizing acceptance of death as the way to overcome those irrational fears. Overcoming the fears should have nothing to do with perceiving death as inevitable. Rather, one needs to simply use reason to evaluate the facts of reality, and then to act on the conclusions of one's reason. What is it that one is afraid of? What is it other than one's life that one has to lose? What could one gain? What is the upside of making a decision as well as the downside? How can one weigh the benefits versus the costs of a decision in a manner that, at least as an approximation, makes sense and can serve as a guide to the next steps that one will take? Once again, it's a very calculated, down-to-earth kind of approach. It doesn't require thinking of one's own obliteration. Jobs, back in 2005, spoke of his pancreatic cancer, and he said it was the closest thing I'd been to facing death, and I hope it's the closest I get for a few more decades. And again, it's very sad that this did not come true, that he did not live a few more decades. But it's an interesting question as to why he established that time frame of a few more decades with regard to when he would want to face this issue again, or at least this was the time frame for which he wanted to delay facing this issue. He was in his early 50s when he made that address, and he would be in his early 80s or 90s in a few more decades. And one aspect of this is cultural conditioning. In our time and culture, it's considered a fruitful, fulfilling, long life if one has lived into one's 80s or 90s. Now, this was not always that way. Those same considerations were made in the Middle Ages with respect to someone who had lived into his 50s or 60s. Indeed, Steve Jobs, if he had died in the year 1500, would have been considered to have lived quite a long life. He would have been considered to have been an old man, indeed an old man for about 2 decades prior to his death. So a lot of people would have just said, well, it's natural that someone died at 56. However, societal attitudes and expectations have changed because technology has improved and has been able to enhance the average human life expectancy. Now, Jobs' death at the age of 56 is seen as a tragedy, and Jobs himself undoubtedly saw it as a tragedy. He did not want to die. And it seems to me that pushing this problem back a few decades is a long enough margin of time for the idea of death to become a mere idea again, just an intellectual concept which one could rationalize into everyday existence, something that's a background presence but doesn't directly affect oneself yet. So it's easier to accept death then than if it's an urgent, pressing reality that could happen any day. Of course, no one, except seriously disturbed individuals, would like to die tomorrow. Steve Jobs did not want to die the next day. He did not want to die when he did. This is indeed the reason why Aubrey de Grey focuses so much on extension of youthful life and eradication of the diseases of old age. He asks the question of, if you are young and healthy right now, would you want to die tomorrow? And clearly the answer is no. So if you ask that question every day, and every day you stay relatively young and healthy, then your answer as to whether you would want to die tomorrow will be no, irrespective of whether that question is asked 5 months from now or 100 years from now, as long as you stay youthful and your quality of life remains high. And I think that was the same for Steve Jobs. And Jobs did say, no one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet death is the destination we all share. Again, the idea of death as being inevitable, inescapable, which is something that Jobs seems to presuppose without really presenting evidence for it. He does say no one has ever escaped it, but again, just because something has not been done in the past does not necessarily mean it will not be done in the future under different conditions. But here is where Jobs presents his normative view of death, which I think is the greatest problem with his remarks. He says, and that is as it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. Now, this is an idea that one encounters all too frequently. My first response is, why assume that the old and new cannot coexist? Indeed, this would be quite a cruel way to introduce change, to kill sentient, rational beings, and indeed millions and eventually billions of them needlessly so. Wouldn't it be the case that if what one values is beneficial change, progress, then more diversity, more mutually beneficial interaction, more exchange of ideas can occur if more people from more generations are alive, youthful, and working at the same time? Wouldn't it be great, for instance, if Steve Jobs and Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton and some inventor from the early 22nd century could all sit together and share ideas about how to invent technologies or how to conduct scientific research? Wouldn't it be amazing what these great minds of the past and the future, if they were gathered together, could accomplish? Maybe they would even disagree with each other and have heated arguments, but out of those heated arguments would come the identification of crucial issues and multiple different approaches that different people would try in competition with one another to get at the best result. Second, Jobs' argument implies that death is teleologically beneficial, that it's some great cosmic blessing, as opposed to just an accident of nature caused by the breakdown of a complex system. My view is much like a computer or an iPod might break down, living organisms break down too. And it's for the same essential reasons. Something failed. Some component failed. The interaction of the components was no longer sustainable in a beneficial manner, either because of some flaw within the system or the introduction of some external harm-causing agent. As an atheist, a philosophical materialist, and a rationalist, I cannot accept that if terrible things happen to good people, this must somehow be part of a cosmic greater good. That seems to me to be the Panglossian fallacy of what is right, a fallacy that Voltaire exposed quite thoroughly and with a lot of biting satire in Candide. To me, death is a failure. And it's a failure that is preventable with enough knowledge and technology. Just as today, if one maintains one's house, or maintains one's car, or maintains one's computer, one can at the very least greatly extend their longevity. Some cars and houses have been maintained in good condition for nearly a century. Death is tragic precisely because it's pointless, and it has no benefits that could come anywhere nearly to compensating for the cost. Think about this. If an individual dies, that is an entire universe extinguished, an entire internal world of experiences, memories, ideas, aspirations that can never again be replicated. And what's the benefit, according to Mr. Jobs? It's change. It's sweeping out the old to make way for the new. Maybe a little bit more innovation, though I don't buy that. I don't think that justifies the tremendous costs of obliterating an entire universe. Indeed, 150,000 of those universes every day. Third, Jobs' argument implies that irrespective of whether we want to live, it is justified for us to be killed off against our will, to be, in his words, swept away in order for something new to replace us. To an individualist who considers the individual to be of the utmost moral value, this ultimate compulsion, this ultimate deprivation of life should be abhorrent. And fourth, who says the new is necessarily better than the old? Who says that what is swept away is inferior to what will replace it? I agree that we should seek progress, which is beneficial change, but not just change for its own sake. And with regard to death, it doesn't matter whether you're an innovator or a Luddite. It doesn't matter whether you are a virtuous person or an evil person. In the present state of our ignorance, death will take both the good and the bad. Death will take both those who could have improved the world and those who could have caused harm if they had remained alive. So, Jobs' argument simply doesn't stand up if what he wants to say is that death is an agent of progress. He's right to say that death is an agent of change per se, but why should we assume that that change is beneficial change? I certainly don't see that as being the case. Finally, with regard to this segment of his remarks, Jobs says, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition." To this I respond that I'm sympathetic with a lot of what he is saying here. I also agree that it's important to eschew blind conformity and dogma, but the reason to do so is not because one's time is limited, but because one hopes for something better than the standard paths and outcomes that one sees in the world around oneself. It's ambition for the future, the desire to create a better life, not the urgency of death, that results in innovation and aspiration. I think implicitly, many of us grasp this. Implicitly, Steve Jobs tried to lead a good life. He did not always make good decisions, but he made enough good decisions to leave a positive mark on the world. Unfortunately, the explicit acceptance of death, indeed the attempt to justify death as somehow cosmically beneficial, is a trap that Mr. Jobs fell into, just like millions, if not billions, of other people fall into, because while implicitly and through their everyday decisions they do accept life and try to improve their situation, try to plan for the future, try to create something good in the world, they do live with this specter of their own demise. And they have a choice with regard to how to face that. Either they try to combat it, which is hard, in which case they'd have to recognize what a terrible obstacle it is, and what a terrible age of barbarism we live in, that this problem has not yet been solved. Or else they could try to rationalize it away and give their everyday lives a kind of feeling of fundamental cosmic peace, if one could put it that way, because they think all is right with existence, with what some might call the cycle of life, of birth and death, whereas in fact it isn't. But by convincing themselves that it is, they could focus more on the routine aspects of life without combating and confronting that great peril. But I think it ought to be combated and confronted. It's It's a great tragedy what happens to 150,000 people every day. It's a great tragedy what happened to Steve Jobs because his internal universe was also extinguished. And I wish it hadn't been. I wish that the advances that will come in the future would not have come too late for Steve Jobs. Because certainly we could have benefited from his innovation and his creativity for an indefinite amount of time longer.